Okay, so today we're going to be talking about climate justice. So first, let's first take a look at it, the official definition of climate justice. So what is climate justice? Climate justice is the intersection between social justice and climate change, and how the most marginalized communities, both globally and locally, will be disproportionately impacted by climate change. So simply put, this is my definition. It is the combination of social justice and climate change, and it forms a positive feedback loop between the two things. So what that means is that I think when it comes to climate justice, the two parts, both the climate part and the justice part, they have this mutually reinforcing relationship between them. So what that means is that if we have worse climate change, we're going to have worse social justice issues, and vice versa. So first, let's take a look at the first example of climate injustice. And this actually has to do with our first R, which is reflection. We're reflecting on what has happened before and what were some of the actions that we took in order to combat those issues regarding climate injustice. So the first one here is it actually took place in Yonkers, New York, and it has to do with global warming. So during the June heat wave in the United States, researchers found that streets in poor areas were up to 3 to 10 degrees Celsius hotter. And this is because of too much asphalt, concrete, and the lack of plants and trees. And this condition, often takes place in poor communities and more, disadvantaged communities. And the quote below actually is from one of the Yonkers residents. The sun is just beating down directly on you, and it's just unbearable. So yeah, that just shows you one of the most recent examples of climate injustice. And let's actually take a look at the second specific example. It was actually presented in a TED Talk by this lady, and she was originally from Honduras, which is a poor small country in the South America. And this case actually has to do with natural disasters, and more specifically, Hurricane Mitch. This hurricane took place in the end of last century, and it was the worst hurricane probably in the history of humanity. And some of the impacts it caused were the destruction of buildings, bridges, homes, and the connections between communities. And what I found really interesting is actually the last part, the connection between communities. In the TED Talk, she mentioned how if you imagine you and some of your family members live in different parts of the country and the bridges are broken, the transportations are, broken, and the internet doesn't work when the hurricane hit. So what are you going to do about it? People just have this mental breakdown. You don't even know whether your other family members are doing well. So yeah, I think that's just a very miserable condition to be in. And the second impact is it has to deal with the flood, which often comes with a hurricane, destroying agriculture and economy. And this is especially significant in this poor country because there are a lot of farmers, and a huge proportion of their economy has to deal with agriculture. And when the flood hits, all of their farmlands are destroyed, and they basically lost everything for them. And this is very miserable as well. And the third one is the most miserable I found is the spread of diseases like malaria, dengue, and cholera, killing 10,000 to 15,000 people and making the hurricane the worst in the past 200 years. Yeah, so this is one of the most, one of the worst examples of climate injustice. And now I want to talk about some of the other significant issues that I don't think get talked enough about. And the first one has to do with climate migration, which is when severe disasters caused by climate change take place. The only way for people to adapt to the sudden changes is to migrate. And this is a very daunting data below. 26.4 million people per year have been displaced by natural disasters. But there are more problems. So the first one is while the wildfire and flood, which are actually happening in the world more frequently right now, are pushing poor people out of their homes. the surrounding underprivileged communities do not have enough infrastructure to absorb them. And this actually has to do with the whole, social welfare system and infrastructures, which makes the whole issue of climate justice even more complex. And the second one here actually has to do with our second R, which is restoration. What it means by restoration is that before we take actions regarding all these climate justice issues, we need to evaluate the risks and benefits of these actions, whether they are harming the communities that we try to protect. And this is one of the perfect examples of this is that a public housing neighborhood called Tidewater Gardens, it was to be replaced, and it was to the area that it was sitting in was used for a mixed use project, and the project itself was made for poor communities impacted by the flood. But there are a lot of questions raised regarding how people are thinking the initiative is just another example of urban gentrification that excludes non-white contractors. So this is actually a racial issue. This is a social justice issue. So while we're thinking about helping all these disadvantaged communities and how we are addressing the social injustice and the climate injustice issues, we really need to think about we really need to evaluate the risks before we take these actions, and how other people and other communities, and maybe the communities themselves that we're trying to help, whether they are actually harmed by these actions. So that has to do with that has to do with our second R, which is restoration. Okay, and the second significant issues I want to talk about, and I think is not talked enough about, and it's the most interesting things that I found during this challenge. It actually has to do with renewable energy. So this is one of the critical issues I believe people should pay much more attention on, is the inequality in the renewable energy industry. So right now, we're talking about like renewable energy sources more often because of the climate change, because of the worsening climate change. And we need to replace all these energy that's created by fossil fuels, and we need renewable energy sources. But a very recent research published by UC Berkeley actually talked about how the disadvantaged communities are subject to significant disparities in access to solar power. And the reasons behind that is first of all, they have much less grid hosting capacity, meaning that around their neighborhood, around their community, they can't store as much electricity as the other communities. And the second reason is that they have much smaller roof space, which is a technical issue that we're dealing with here. So I really think that we need to address these issues in advance, because we have just started to implementing all these renewable energy sources in a large scale because of climate change. And we just need to think about these issues and really evaluate the exact actions that we're taking, and we need to prevent them from growing larger. We need to prevent all these issues from growing larger in the future. And this is another perfect example of restoration. Okay, now let's move on to the next section, which is, I believe, one of the most important sections in this presentation, is that how can we act, what can we do, and what can we acknowledge? And this actually has to do with our third R, which is reparation. So what they mean by reparation is that we need to, identify these issues, and we need to think about whether we are part of the issue first, and what are some of the ways that we can use to help address these issues. So although climate change is not taught in many of our schools, at least that's the case for my own high school and a lot of high schools of my friends, we can support these organizations by directly participating. We have the Indigenous Environment Network, we have 350.org, we have Black Millennial for Flint, etc. These organizations are growing and they need support. So we can just go on their website and look for ways to participate directly and even donate. And the second way that we can, the second action that we can take is that we can join our local student organizations to present these problems as possible solutions to student boards and legislatures directly. And the one that I am personally involved in is CASC, California Association of Student Council. It is a student-led organization that's focused on, presenting all kinds of issues to legislators and student boards in order to make the voice of the students heard. So that's another, I think, one of the best ways that we can get involved in. We can actually take actions to address the problem of climate injustice. And the third one, I think, is more direct, is to form a school club and make social media videos on climate justice issues to raise awareness, like this one. We can make your own YouTube channel or some just post videos and use all these platforms and use your school club to address all these kinds of issues and raise awareness, because sometimes these issues are not talked enough about in our high school. So that's what we need to do to raise awareness and to spread these kinds of information. And the fourth way that we can get involved in and take action is that we can urge our high school to post acknowledgement of the indigenous land on which it is sitting on. I found this more common in colleges and universities, for example, like UC Berkeley and all the other universities that I've visited. They have this acknowledgement saying that they are sitting on the land of some indigenous people who actually had this land, and their land was deprived from them due to some historical reasons. And I think it's very important for us to acknowledge that because that's part of our history, that's part of the climate justice issue, and that's just part of what's right to do. And I found this less common in high schools, and I really think that we should start focusing on this in our high school, and we can just urge our high school, talk to your counselor, probably talk to your principals as a group of students, as a club or as individuals, and to see if this is possible. Okay, so the last one actually has to do with our last R, which is right relationship. And this is very important while we're helping these marginalized communities, because we need to first be respectful of their culture and experience. They definitely went through a lot of hardship, and we need to listen, and we need to be respectful of their culture and experience. And the second thing that we need to do is that we need to humble ourselves. We need to have the willingness to learn more about the ways that we can help. We can only learn so much on the internet and on ourselves. And the best way for us to learn is by directly interacting with these communities. And we really need to have a humble heart before them to learn, before we learn all of their struggles and the possible ways that we can help. And the third one is that we need to be accountable for our actions. We need to take responsibilities, and we need to be transparent when we're taking actions, and we need to make sure that we're not benefiting ourselves. We're not taking these actions because of our personal interests, but rather we want to serve their communities, and we want to help them with all these issues. Okay, so here's a brief conclusion. So in all the reports regarding climate change, regarding climate justice that I've just read, while voices of some people who are affected are represented, many other stories are never told. And it usually takes too long for their voices to be heard by the general public and for their issues to be addressed appropriately. And one example is the Love Canal incident. It took decades for them to present the issue to the general public and raise awareness and actually eventually have their problems uh, to be addressed. And but that like they sacrifice a lot because of that. Their health and their well-being are sacrificed, and it's just a very bad condition for them. And a lot of other climate injustice issues are not being presented right now, right? They're being ignored by the media. They're not being heard by the general public. So that's what I think is very important for us to think about. And the second one is that one of the most concerning issues I found is the lack of awareness around climate change, around climate justice. So although I consider myself to be very active and I'm actually very passionate about this project and pay a lot of attention to environmental problems, I still learned numerous new things while completing this challenge. Uh, you know, I think that has to do that has something to do with lack of awareness in our high school, probably in our educational system, and that's another issue that I think we need to address. And however, I am very optimistic. I think there's always hope, and I believe that through our combined effort, we will make our world a sustainable and just place to live. And thank you for listening to my presentation. And